Good afternoon, everybody. We had a small audio glitch with our presenters, but I'm here to tell you what they said. They were saying, thank you very much, Ricardo Abramovay. Thank you very much, Rosiska, Dárcy, Oliveira. Thank you very much, Joaquim, Falcão. You really honor the ending to our meeting with your participation, such illustrious guests who are so generous in sharing your knowledge, your skills. We have over 20,000 people enrolled in our FIS week that will be closing today with this panel. It was an intense week full of discussions, full of content, with a huge contribution that we all gave to improve the quality of hospital and medical care in Brazil. We brought specialists from several different industries, not only health, but also from economics, transportation, logistics, retail, from every segment of economy and society to share with us their experiences and the ones that could be incorporated by healthcare to improve what really matters, which is access. That's always what's on our minds, how to guarantee access of the Brazilian population to medical and hospital care with high quality. In closing this week, I would like to reiterate our deepest respect to healthcare professionals who, during the pandemic, dedicated so intensely to treating their patients in often hostile environments with no access to PPE, exposing their lives to protect ours. As a medical doctor, I'm really proud of my colleagues who were at the front line, providing assistance to the population, not only doctors, but also nurses, technicians, psychologists, nutritionists, pharmacists, physical therapists, clerks, receptionists, the stretcher carriers, extremely important, ambulance drivers who were instrumental for us to be able to give support to patients in need. Thank you very much to everybody who worked during the pandemic in supermarkets, garbage trucks doing at-home garbage collection, pharmacies, food delivery professionals, people who allowed us to have access to all of these services. So a heartfelt thanks to all of you. And with that, we will now start our meeting, ending this FIS week. But before I do so, I want to thank the dozens of people working backstage to make FIS week a successful event. So I want to offer you my standing ovation for that. And with that, I want to introduce to you our honorable guests, Professor Rosiska, Dárcy, Oliveira, a dear friend and an extremely intellectual person, a member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, a renowned writer. She is a unique personality that deserves our deepest respect and admiration, and especially my heartfelt thanks to you, Rosiska. We also have with us Professor Joaquim Falcão, who is half from Rio, half from Olinda. He was born in Rio, but his soul, his background belongs in Pernambuco, especially in Olinda. So he's constantly taking the shuttle service, and I found that out during Carnival. He was the founder of a Carnival band during his youth in Olinda. He is an extraordinary person with an extremely high quality intellectual content, a great writer, and a member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. And last but not least, Professor Ricardo Abramovay, an economist with the unique characteristic of being a contemporary man who respects society, who is always trying to find the means to find social responsibility for the economy. Thank you very much. He's a great professor at the University of São Paulo. Thank you very much, Professor Ricardo Abramovay. Thank you very much, Professor Rosiska, Dárcy, Oliveira, and thank you very much, Professor Joaquim Falcão. We'll start our meeting talking about the ethical challenge of combining economics, science, and humanism with Professor Joaquim Falcão. The floor is yours, Professor. Thank you. Thank you, and congratulations on the initiative. Josier is a leader of his profession and of medical education in Brazil. We'll talk about combining science, ethics, and humanity. Ricardo Abramovay is a very rare specimen in that he is an economist who's also humane. He has nothing to do with the orthodox financial aspects that brought us where we are now. So it is a pleasure to be here standing by him and Rosiska, my dear friend throughout my life from the Academy of Letters. And she is a very prominent name in terms of the ethical conduct that we must adopt in society. So I was left with science, and I was left with discussing how to combine science, ethics, and humanity. So I'm going to do that in a very short manner. I have one message, and this is my main message to you tonight. Each civilization, and this is the civilization of the 21st century, each civilization has a different goal. Rome, I'll start far away from us, but that's going to be quick. In Rome, their goal was to conquer territories through its armies. After that, the main goal of the Greek civilization was art, philosophy, and understanding the human being. The Phoenicians, their goal was trading and expanding trade through the oceans. And what is the purpose of our current civilization? Well, the current civilization, its main purpose is to achieve more life, more wealth, which equates to greater well-being, and more justice. But we want to reach these goals, more health, justice, and wealth, differently from others. It's not through the armies or trade expansion, but rather it will be through scientific knowledge. It's not through God or religions. What really defines us is to use scientific knowledge to achieve our goals, to live longer, to live better, and to live with more justice. So that's aspect number one. Science is the toolbox of the current civilization. And that's something that we've been seeing recently in 2 episodes that require from science and that require action from science, and science has been responding. We've been seeing 2 dramatic episodes, which is the issue of the environment that impacts us all. And what we're seeing in Glasgow is something that crisscrosses civilizations and will either join hands around this purpose or will all perish. And the fight against COVID. These are 2 dramatic challenges to health, to wealth, that we have to face, and we have been facing with scientific knowledge. So justice today is equivalent to applying science to all. This is what being just is about. And the prolongation of life for everyone by fighting pandemics and the greenhouse gas effects and climate change. So you see, we are living in an era where we'll either advance through science or we will not survive. And health and medicine have a decisive importance in that regard. The Constitution, and I speak on behalf of the legal area, the Constitution delegates what to do. So there's a constitutional delegation, as it were. And to act constitutionally is to act according to science. So that is my first take-home message for you about the challenges of our current civilization have been demanding almost like a scientific emergency from scientific knowledge, as it were. And that affects healthcare professionals, it affects students. I am part of the Cancer Foundation that was created by Marcus Morais. And our goal is to attempt to balance out this different characteristic of our age. So I've talked about health. I talked about life. I talked about justice, but I didn't talk about ethics. And this is what I want to talk about now. And in doing so, I am going to design my proposal. And I'm talking about global issues, and Brazil is inserted in that scenario. So now I will bring my feet to reality, to the Brazilian reality. And I'm going to do that by talking about the environment and medicine and the environment. Evidently, this agenda of climate change, this is a global agenda that is highly connected with the Amazon biome. And if I focus on Brazilian reality and on the reality of Rio de Janeiro specifically, along with the importance of Amazon, we have the Atlantic forest biome, which is of even greater importance, I would say, which is where most of the Brazilian population lives. And we're not giving it the due importance to the protection of the Atlantic forest biome. A young secretary from Rio, he was my student, and he's the secretary of the environment in Rio. And he said, well, the thing about the environment is the degraded areas. It's these slums. It's the communities with no water, with no sewage system. And okay, the Amazon, we have to be concerned about it, but the most urgent agenda we should be focusing on is health and scientific knowledge of the places where we live. And we're not giving due importance to this urgency. And this is the basic problem. And I said that I was going to talk about ethics, because the ethics of democracy is to treat everybody equally. That's what our ethics is like. But in health, no one can be different. In justice, no one can be different. We should all be treated equally. So my subject matter, and you probably noticed that I outlined it, and I may be combining science, ethics, and humanities. The ethics of humankind in Brazil today is to fight inequality, above all in healthcare.
And in the results that we have about who were the greatest victims of the pandemic, and the environment, which is a concern to us, is not the environment that is far away from us. Meaning, I think that we need to have an urgent environmental medicine for the least favored populations in Brazil. This is my point. We need to have environmental medicine urgently. And why do I say environmental and urgent? Environmental, because for its majority, at the time of pandemic over the past few years, an area of growth has been created of destruction of the environment. It's 20%. And this is where we need to be, because diseases come from the lack of sewers, lack of space, a very unfavorable demography, and the diseases. Well, we already know about that. Diphtheria, malnutrition, skin problems. All of these, and these are all environmental problems. So they're caused by the environment. And by the way, cities are constituted in terms of our environment, so much so that ethics and means this. How can we, through science and justice, face this problem which is a priority for us? So this is my point. Well, there are some initiatives of society in terms of defense of the Atlantic forest, defense of the biome in the Atlantic forest, but that has not yet become a priority, a health priority for the least favored populations. Skin diseases, a malnourished child has an intellectual performance and school performance that is much lower. So we need we don't have a scientific program for the mid and long term for environmental medicine for these populations. And then I need to explain, and I will close after that, my final words. I said urgent environmental medicine. Well, we cannot wait, even though it looks like it's inevitable, and that we should build sewer networks, that drinking water should be piped that would create property rights. The Brazil cannot wait. The Brazil is not a Brazil of reform. I don't care for reforms of any government. What I want to know is about the urgent matters, the urgent programs. These people have urgency for life, urgency for health. And you are responsible and you are competent to deal with that. As we say in Pernambuco, I feel very bad because there is installed capacity, scientific knowledge, and leaders available to deal with this problem. And as a native of the state of Pernambuco, I cannot fail but end with by quoting a renowned native of the state of Pernambuco, who somehow talks about the ethics of science and humanity. Rosiska and I know, in our generation, we know very well the pain of these words. We are well aware how painful these words can be and the warning that they carry. Don Elder Camara used to say, we need to discover the second disease of Brazilians because the first one we already know. That's hunger. And I would add, is inequality. It's the need to live better with better health. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much, Professor Joaquim Falcão. Brilliant words about humanistic thinking, and at these times that are so toxic and so difficult that we are living in Brazil, we need people like you who can speak to us with such clarity and depth. And this needs to be owned by our population, by the political leaders. I think that shortly ago we were ending another block with the FIS week with Neca Setúbal, and she was also saying that we need to end with just saying things for saying and make things happen. In fact, there is an urgency. I had never thought of that I don't want reform and first the urgency. So which are our urgencies? What is urgent in Brazil? Well, dialogue is necessary. Joaquim Falcão, you know, you are an example of a person working in the legal area with great skill for communication. And more specifically, in terms of building bridges. And you worked with three people who are so different as Celso Furtado, Gilberto Freire, Roberto Marinho, such different personalities, and you were able to build through dialogue a possibility of making things happen by a firm purpose. And in your papers, without interrupting you, but I would just like to emphasize right now that we had the first ecology program in Open TV in the world. And the one that lasted the longest, which is Global Ecology. And that show was the initiative of Claudio Savageri and other colleagues, was really a pioneer. And it's worth watching it again. I think that's it. I think it is even considering different thoughts, which is good, diversity of thoughts, we have a unity of purpose. And this purpose of assuring access to life through good health, good education, good housing, this is all that we need in Brazil. And now I would turn the floor to Professor Ricardo Abramovay for his opening comments. Thank you very much, Professor Abramovay, for your kind presence here today. Ricardo, you are one of those figures, as our dear Joaquim Falcão said, you are a humanistic economist. And within those lines of thought that our dear Joaquim Falcão mentioned, do you think we will be able to walk out from the pandemic, from this tragedy that we are dealing with, by building a model of economy that is socially responsible and capable of reducing inequalities in the world? So, Ricardo Abramovay, you're most welcome. Thank you very much, Josier. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, with Joaquim and Rosiska. I admire all of you so much. And I have prepared, and when I saw the title of our panel, and then combining science, ethics, and humanity, I prepared something which is not really a response to the question that you're proposing, Josier, and the question that you ask can only be answered by an affirmation, a statement. If we can't do that, well, so we shouldn't do anything then. And what Joaquim mentioned, this year we are celebrating 75 years since the publication of the Geography of Hunger. And so Josué de Castro, chair in the School of Medicine of the University of São Paulo and in its School of Public Health, is going to hold an event on the 75 years of the publication of the Geography of Hunger. And this is a theme that cannot be avoided in Brazil. But for our conversation, I have prepared something that goes around this theme. Why do we need to combine science, ethics, and humanity? Aren't these themes naturally compatible and necessarily compatible already? How can we think outside the parallel departments a science that is unethical? well, and it doesn't serve humanity. That being the case, it would not just be compatible with ethics and humanity, but society would naturally see it and provide full support to its development. I have made this caricatural description naturally because it doesn't correspond to facts. Since the 17th century, the suspicion against science, which is permanent, not just against Galileo, but also Darwin along the 20 years he took to publish The Origin of the Species. And it's very interesting to hear the podcast 20,000 Leagues, where they tell the story and the writing that Darwin did. It's very interesting. During the 20th century, the fight against science was related to the planetary science, which really killed the science and the German national science during the Nazism. But be careful, it would be a mistake to imagine that science is threatened just by totalitarianism. Denial and scientific negation has gained strength not just under extreme right governments such as Trump and Bolsonaro, but one of the worst events or phenomenon of the current pandemic. It largely responds for the conspiratory theories whose results are the refusal to vaccination and the dignity of defeating the pandemic, even in rich countries with democratic governments, as we are seeing now in the reincidence of the pandemic in the European Union. How can we explain that? How can we explain this resistance to science? One of the great thinkers of the 20th science, the sociologist Robert Merck, showed that even in democracies, science is threatened because it speaks a language that is distant from everyday lives of people, because it touches themes that whose importance people do not understand, because the results of science are not what will confirm common sense. So Martin demonstrates that to face these prejudices, scientists organize themselves in a community that has its own ethos, which consists of sharing ideas, exposing results for specialized criticism, and give up the theories whenever they prove themselves to be insufficient or mistaken, with impersonal criteria to circumscribe errors for what he calls organized skepticism. Scientists, before anything, they are people who doubt. They have questions to ask. Somehow Popper's work is a philosophical, epistemological version of what Merton says. How do I know if a proposition is scientific? There's no magic formula for that. So I choose a proposition, expose it to peers and to their opinion. That's why it's so important to have specialized scientific journals. And this is why it's a crime that is committed against cappies. It's a crime when you put someone who is incapable of running an organization such as cappies. Science is not about truth and uncertainty. It's about criticism and doubt, but doubt and criticism based on the most advanced and sophisticated knowledge.
The result is that science is always safer the more it is protected in an ivory tower that protects it against the influence of society. And for the Nice, that guarantees the ethos that guarantees the independence of scientific production is very important. The attacks that the scientific organizations have been suffering in our country on the part of the federal government require this independence. In the Trump administration, there was also this threat against science. But when it comes to science, ethics, and humanity, that is only a part, albeit important, of the story. And here's where the most interesting part of the subject that was proposed to us begins. After World War II, not only did the concentration camps and the experiences that occurred there, but also with the explosion of the bomb of Hiroshima and the consequence of the risks that it brought about to the entirety of the life on planet and humankind, the advocacy of science took on a very different path than that which consists in strengthening the ivory tower. In the time frame that was generously offered to us, I cannot explain this process, but today, what Merton called the ethos of science and what Porter consecrated in his epistemology received at least two absolutely fundamental supplements. The first refers to the protagonists of science, and the second concerns the objectives of science, the purposes of science. And this is the true ethical issue. The protagonists of science. Who are the scientists? We can no longer treat scientists as neutral subjects, as bearers of what society wishes to know about the world in concrete means. One of the places where science is more developed, which are the American universities focusing on digital revolution. The Silicon Valley, for instance, is a place where scientific knowledge is strikingly impacted by sexism and racism to an extremely large extent. It's not something marginal. It's at the core of not only the way that science is done, but also the result of science itself. Sexism and racism are present in the Silicon Valley, and there's a vast literature about that. The connection between science and companies is absolutely crucial. Who funds science? And what about the funding offered by denialists of tobacco and the tobacco industry? And what about food and ultra-processed foods? And the disastrous effects on human health in the 21st century. Currently, there's been great progress in that direction. Scientists, in order to publish something, they have to show who funded their research, and showing that their research is actually independent, placing science in a democratic environment that is fundamental. A professor of Minas Gerais University published an article on science called the Global Citizen Deliberation about the great scientific subjects that affect our lives cannot simply be treated exclusively inside the ivory tower. And with the companies with which the ivory tower has connections with, citizens are increasingly more present in science. The climate convention in France shows the fertility of initiatives by which citizens question scientists about the phenomena that they relate to, the control of citizens over what science does. For instance, when it comes to personal data protection, in light of the digital revolution and medicine, the specialty to which Josier is a pioneer in Brazil, that's increasingly more important. Contemporary medicine is supported on 4 pillars. It's personalized, preventive, and it is participative. It's not a pure formality that when you're at a hospital, the nurse will say everything that you are going to be given as a treatment. But not only that, the use of personal data to advance with medical research is a very important subject that is being discussed with citizens under risk of us submitting ourselves to situations where our personalities and subjectivity will be impacted. It goes beyond that. We have NGOs today discussing science and members of NGOs publishing in the best scientific journals. And one last aspect concerning who are the protagonists of science concerns what great Edward Cole Wilson at age 87 has been disseminating for the last 20 years, which is the integration between science and humanities. Our biggest challenge today is that the teams that produce scientific knowledge have to be teams that are truly cross or transdisciplinary. And by cross and transdisciplinary, it doesn't mean placing an anthropologist, an economist, and a sociologist together. It's to understand the mistakes made in this interface between humanities, society, and sciences of the earth. More than that, to integrate science with the lores of the peoples from the forest and integrating science and art. And as a member, collaborator of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, that is fundamental because it sends an appeal to science. Science should be humble. We should not expose ourselves to scientificism or the idea that only scientific knowledge is valid. As important as it may be, now more than ever, it is absolutely fundamental. Artistic knowledge, religious knowledge, the different manifestations of human intellect have to crisscross and irrigate science. The ivory tower has collapsed, and that's excellent news to science. When it comes to goals, since Hans Jonas published the principle of responsibility, talking about the ethics of technological civilization, science can no longer be considered simply as knowledge about the world. Ethics is the discipline of philosophy that studies the purposes and the goals of human science. We need science to help us overcome this fissure between nature and society. Science that is not a science that is there to dominate, as Descartes said, to transform nature and to transform ourselves into masters and lords of nature. Certainly the IPCC reports are moving towards that. And to reiterate what Joaquim Falcão said so brilliantly, we need a science that allows us to overcome this divide between economics and ethics as science. And I believe that the SDGs are moving also towards that direction. And those seem to be the ways forward to combine science, ethics, and humanities. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You gave us a wonderful lecture as usual. Before I give the floor to Professor Rosiska, a great writer and a member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, I would only like to mention to Rosiska, among the things that Joaquim Falcão mentioned, Ricardo mentioned the Silicon Valley as a very important hub to be observed in terms of racism and sexism that we should not repeat as a reference for the development of innovation and technologies and such things. And currently we talk a lot about the full inclusion of Black and brown people, women, and the LGBT community. And what I see is that we defined that quotas for Blacks and women could be a way to offer them a way to um, achieve a social ascension. And Rosiska, do you think that, in your opinion, quotas are enough, or should we rather build extra doors for increasing the citizenship level of people who are left outside of it from a conceptual standpoint? And do you think it's possible to combine ethics and social responsibility and market economics? So welcome, Rosiska. Thank you very much for being here with us again.
Thank you very much, Josier, for your invitation. Congratulations already for the success of your event, which is no surprise to me because everything you do is a success. And congratulations to you and all your staff. Uh, And to me, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you because it gives me an opportunity, and I am going to somehow reaffirm or repeat your own words of making a public acknowledgement, which I find is always necessary. It doesn't matter that it is repeated to all those, and especially the researchers and scientists, researchers, and physicians, and all healthcare workers, and those who were and who still are, because this is far from ending still, that are still on the front lines fighting this global tragedy which happened to us, and which is the coronavirus pandemic. I would like to say thank you precisely to those and researchers who were trying to find the vaccine and were caught by surprise very drastically at a time when science was going through a splendid time, and somehow it believed itself to be almighty. Uh, and they knew everything about the cell to the outer space. There was innovation, questions, there was research, and it transmitted a feeling of omnipotence, a feeling that we can respond to everything or anything with the tools that science provided. And we were caught by surprise, by a mystery, because in the beginning of the pandemic, what we had was just big mystery. Everything was a mystery. No one knew anything. And science was somehow put down from the high place where it was, and like any other mortal was thrown into uncertainty, doubt, fear. Well, everything that I don't need to repeat, and which constituted and still is the experience of this pandemic. And in spite of all of that, science reacted and faced this situation, just like the physicians. They did the same thing, and healthcare workers who, who also didn't know how to deal with that, or they knew very little about it. And even so, they risked their lives. And they are still risking their lives. And I witnessed the significant loss of some doctors that were my doctors. So I have a feeling of grief for them that is very strong. And I would like to thank them and to thank all of you. On the other hand, I think that there is an important experience for everyone in terms of combining research and humanity. Let's leave ethics for later. Well, but there was a combination between research and humanity. And as I remember, the approximation was so great between medicine, science, and the ordinary mortal person. So what Ricardo put very well has in science a feeling of distance because they do not know what happens in that world. But there has never been maybe such a great approximation and such a great feeling of respect for science and for medicine. And I think that this is a moment that we shouldn't miss. And many questions may be asked of why this is all happening. I would like to use an example which I find important on this debate that has been postulated both by Joaquim and Ricardo about the issue of a democratic ethics for health. And taking the example, I would say that Brazil is a case to be studied because Brazil is precisely at the time or in a situation in which other countries in the world are too. We're not the only one, but there is a wave, a obscurantist wave that is terrible, that increases every day all over the world. So this obscurantist wave doesn't stem out of nothing. And its greatest enemy is science. They dread science, just as they abhor culture and art. But science is our theme here. And taking science as an enemy is precisely due to the fact that science, in the last 50 years maybe, it was more transforming to society than social movements. It even led to society movements, and it transformed the world in such a way and was transforming the world in such a way that this caused a feeling of insecurity. And this obscurantism didn't come from nothing. It needs to be explained. Why did it appear in this way? And I think that it didn't stem from nothing. It's the best witness of the fear that changes cause. They cause fear, and also this happens especially in the most, they have a feeling of insecurity in the crudest groups. There are many repressed ghosts that appear. So the obscurantist fury wants to stop time and history. They want to shut science, to silence science, also to silence social movements. It clings to what is most backwards in religious discourse. I would say that obscurantism is the visible face of a repressed fear of oneself, maybe, and of what threatens more than anything, which is the freedom of others. Now, one first task Maybe right now, one of the most pressing tasks is to prevent obscurantism and the fear of the unknown to block the path of science and technological innovation. I would say that blocking science is of extreme severity. It's very grave situation. And Ricardo gave some examples of the destruction of centers of knowledge, which is something that is constant in all such regimes in the world, the destruction of centers of knowledge, research centers, considering research as their greatest enemy. And I repeat, now we are concluding that paradoxically, obscurantism thrives precisely as a direct relationship with the complexity of life. When the progress of science advances, obscurantism advances too. This is one first concern that I have, something that I would like to underline and leave here is the need to fight by all means obscurantism. This is one point which is fundamental to me. Another thing is the pandemic, and this was also a major discovery, and it was something that revealed, others for the whole world. But somehow it was interesting announced at Davos Conference in December 2019, when, to my surprise, and I think to the surprise of everyone that were paying attention to the climate crisis, but then in reporting the major global threats, Davos Conference announced that the first, number one, pandemics that really caught my attention, because we didn't hear much about that. I don't know, except in very specialized cycles or circles rather. But all of a sudden that was top in terms of global concerns, and second was the climate crisis. Now, what happens afterwards, I don't need to say. It was not just science that was taken by surprise, but also populations. Because why do I say that the pandemic is a regulator? Because it revealed immense precariousness just all over the world, precariousness of collective resources to deal with such a big threat. The WHO is maybe the only global health organization, maybe, I don't know, but the one that was the most important. It demonstrated it had scarce resources, no matter how much effort they made. It was poorly equipped to deal with the pandemic. Well, globalization can be described in many different ways. And one of them is the frantic movement of airplanes, huge airplanes with people from everywhere going everywhere in airports that are like cities. And in a bit more than one day, anyone can go around the globe and would take with them your talents, physical features, culture, but also their what is wrong with them, such as a sneeze. You take it too. Globalization is also that. The viruses that have no passport, and then they won't set off the metal detector, are the invisible terrorists, the inevitable illegal immigrants. and they see no borders, they travel unknown, as well as capitals. So they travel freely, the two, the virus and capitals. Well, the pandemic is here. And the world that demonstrated to be vulnerable, very vulnerable. Well, I am saying this because any proposal to better deal with this situation, in my understanding, is going to necessarily come across the ethical issue. And this is not new. In 1948, when Norbert Wiener worked in cybernetics, he said, I am sure that I am introducing a science that can be used for good or for evil, but this is not going to stop. No knowledge goes back, and it doesn't really. And he also added, and he said, well, we shouldn't abandon it.
We shouldn't abandon it because otherwise it will be snatched by the worst ones. Hardly did he know how true that was. But I apply this to every science. And with that, I go back to the subject already mentioned by Ricardo, which is the subject of how we produce science and how we distribute science, which is a subject that is more discussed by Joaquim, who produces science, who funds it, how they fund it. And when you asked me, Josier, to talk about the fact that in the major universities, science is sexist and racist, I think that at least when it comes to sexism, that is certainly true. Otherwise, in Harvard, we wouldn't have had a dean that stated that women were not a good fit for mathematics. So that is so grotesque that it's almost not worthy insisting on that. But it's true. But that also means that everything that was produced as science over the course of history was done in absentia of women, and everything that was about women was produced in their absence. And there's this very interesting book by a psychoanalyst called This Sex, which is not one, referring to one of Lacan's theses, which also refers to the scientific thinking. About racism, well, the response is being provided by the Black initiatives that are becoming increasingly stronger in advocating for the laws of their people as well as the indigenous peoples. So I wanted to answer your question with this comment, but I'll go back to ethics, which is also one that was mentioned by Joaquim and you, Josier, about access and this distribution of this filter of human spirit, which is science. I think it's interesting because it was one scientist, Professor Hamburger, a Nobel in biology, a member of the Académie Française, that once said that human rights were the jewel of human thinking, because it was human rights that had uplifted us from the condition of being animals. They had created the idea of compassion that nature failed to provide us with natural selection. But I would say that human rights is what Joaquim said or called the ethics of democracy. It is impossible to consider in a country like Brazil, for instance, where we try to make it a democracy, not yet completed, but possibly it will be always like that, but we try to make this country a democracy. It is impossible to build that on the basis of an inequality as huge as ours, which is in and of itself an attack against human rights. It's utterly incompatible with human rights. So overcoming this inequality and creating a more solidary country implies, to my understanding, above anything else, a change of values. And this change of values is required because after a certain point, success started being measured practically and uniquely profit. Profit is the measure of success. It's impossible to build ethics and solidarity when your values are exclusively based on profit. And this statement that profit is a criterion of success has relegated ethics to the status of being naive and elevated criminals to the status of being wise or smart. The choices we make over the course of our lives fundamentally depend on what we value. We choose one thing over another depending on what each thing is worth for us. Values are worth for what they are, but according to the mercantile rationale, that is not so. You don't ask what is the worth of something, but rather what is the price of something. The existence of value is easily converted into currency. And I think that when this economic worth trespasses into values in general, a change happens in society, and that's for the worse. And I believe that already happened because societies ruled by this mindset. In these societies, everything has a price, and these societies render invisible anything without a price. And by definition, whatever is free of charge is valueless or worthless. And in that definition, we could include any initiative of solidarity. I'm going to give you an example. There was a dramatic explosion in the south of France a few years ago, and when the GDP was reported, it showed the losses of the company that had exploded and so on and so forth. But the solidarity initiatives were not even considered. So I believe that talking about solidarity and expecting solidarity, wanting solidarity without reforming the ethical values, which are different than simply the rationale of profit, is impossible. So the discussion on ethics should be in every university, in all medical schools, in all schools, in every public discussion. It should be permanently present, not as naivety or as a pious vote, but rather as a need for salvation and to save a world that is moving towards its own doom. I have a book called The Nature of Scorpio, and I named it like that because I said and used to say that we live in a world that follows the nature of scorpions. It would rather commit suicide than be solidary. So we have to change this scorpion-like nature, and that begins with a discussion like the one that we're having here tonight, where on the one hand, we say, like Joaquim said, we reaffirm the need to fight this inequality in health at all levels. As Ricardo said, the need for us to produce science that is for the good of humankind and not at the expense of humankind. And this is why I'm saying that profit cannot be the measure of success. It should not and cannot be the measure of success. So these are my remarks, and trying to produce a response to my predecessors, and maybe, Josier, you were expecting me to comment on their talks. I had prepared something different, but no, you were great as usual. Thank you very much for your huge contribution. And especially based on this warning that Rosiska, Dárcy Oliveira gave us, I would like for Professor Joaquim and Ricardo to, in 1 minute, leave us with a message of hope and that one can build a road towards better days based on the warnings that Professor Rosiska gave us. Professor Joaquim, please. Your microphone is off. A philosopher said that time is the master of reasoning. I'm deeply concerned with Brazil that only has a future. I think Brazil should treat everything with urgency. So time is actually the lord of health and the health of those in need. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Joaquim Falcão. Ricardo, please. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a huge pleasure to listen to Joaquim and Rosiska tonight. This urgency that Joaquim mentioned reminds me of a remark by Anna Arendt that used to say that we don't have to cultivate a hope. Hope is postponing. We have to act. And she opposed hope to action. And action today starts fundamentally with us getting rid of the fundamentalist fanatism that is currently has currently taken over the capital of Brazil. For as long as that dominates us, it will be impossible for us to have hope. We need to take action. And after taking action, we need to work hard on reconstructing everything, because what these people did to people's heads and souls is terrible, but it will still be studied. So it's all about action. And we have youths watching us, and the youths are giving us the example of action all across the world. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ricardo Abramovay and Professor Joaquim and Professor Rosiska. I would like to wrap up by saying that your discussions were extremely relevant to all of us. As a physician, I can assure you that medical and hospital services, healthcare services in general, are consumption goods. The difference is that they're consumption goods that cannot be regulated by the laws of market exclusively. The market laws cannot regulate this consumption good, because there are other values, both ethical and moral, that have to be considered in our decision-making process. Thank you very much, and be well. Remain alive, because Brazil needs you very much. See you next year, hopefully.